Well, good evening and welcome to our Sunday with Survivor program with Holocaust survivor Mireille Taub. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Before we get our program started this evening, I wanted to let you know that we are recording the program. So if you don't want to be included in the video recording, just turn off your camera. I should add that when we started our Sunday with Survivor program almost a year ago, we started in this meeting format with the goal of trying to foster a community and to have everybody visible and participating in a discussion when it comes time. We then shifted to a webinar format where it was just the speaker who could be seen, but we've gone back to this meeting format in the hope that we can have that community and that communal feeling. So that's why we're doing it. But again, if you don't want to be seen in the recording, just turn off your camera. Okay, one other thing I wanted to mention before we get started, as I always do, I like to put in a plug for our upcoming programs. This coming Wednesday, I will be back with my next Curator's Corner program. I will be talking about a sign that was used to publicize a Nazi exhibit in 1938 in Dusseldorf called about degenerate music, what the Nazis considered degenerate music. The following day, this coming Thursday, October 28th, we are hosting a panel discussion with two authors and a book translator, all of whom have explored how various individuals found ways against all odds to reclaim their heritage, their history, and their birthright after the Holocaust, about returning back to European countries where their families were pushed out of or where they died. So I hope you'll be interested in that discussion. And then one more program to mention, on Tuesday, November 2nd, I will be interviewing Rebecca Frankel about her newest book, which recounts an amazing tale of perseverance, bravery, and love as it follows the Rabinowitz family as they escaped from the Nazis and eventually settled in the United States. So a couple of book programs coming up. To learn more about these programs and to see a full schedule of our upcoming events, you can always go to our website at www.hmtcli.org and click on the events tab. Okay, with those announcements taken care of, I would like to introduce the man behind our Sunday with Survivor program, and that is Michael Mantell. Michael is a 3G who reached out to us about a year ago and was interested in having a Holocaust survivor speak for a group with his family. And we did that program, but then quickly realized that actually this is something we wanted to do for the public, to make it a widely available program. And so we started our Sunday with Survivors program, and that's how we got going. So I'm grateful for Michael's continuing support and his family's continuing interest. And I'm going to pass it over to him to make some more introductions for this evening. Michael.
Thank you so much, Thorin. Thank you to you and to everyone at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for making programs like Sundays with Survivors possible. Thank you as well to everyone here for being a part of this live event and for those of you watching the recording. And thank you to all of the survivors, especially Mireille Taub, who will be sharing her and her late husband's testimonies with us today. Welcome to Sundays with Survivors. The power of this Sundays with Survivors program is that it gives Holocaust survivors the opportunity to share their testimonies with people from all over the world. Last year, after seeing anti-Semitic comments all over social media, I connected with the wonderful folks at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in hopes that we could hold a private event for my friends and family to empower them through Holocaust education to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. And with that, Sundays with Survivors was born. Starting as a one-time private event last year in October 2020, now 1 year later, because of the wonderful response, we are celebrating 1 year of this monthly Sundays with Survivors program. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also very grateful to announce that in addition to our Sundays with Survivors program, we will be starting a 2G Tuesdays beginning Tuesday, November 30th, with our first guest speaker, Fred Gross. 2G Tuesdays is a program that will give children of Holocaust survivors the opportunity to share their parents' testimonies with us. I hope that you find these events as meaningful as I do. If you'd like to learn more about the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, visit their incredible museum, learn about their other amazing educational programs and events, or would like to volunteer with or donate to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, please visit their website at hmtcli.org. Now I'd like to introduce Mireille Taub. Mireille is a Holocaust survivor born in Paris, France. She volunteers as an educator and docent in the anti-bullying and tolerance programs for the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. She also chairs the HMTC David Taub Real Upstanders film series, which showcases films about the Holocaust and targeted populations, and is named in honor of Mireille's late husband, David. A retired literacy specialist, Mireille taught at Dud Junior High School in Freeport for 24 years, Leo F. Giblin Elementary School for 10 years, and as an adjunct in the Basic Education Department at Nassau Community College. Since her retirement, she has worked in various Long Island educational communities as a literacy consultant for the Long Island Writing Project and Malloy College Advisory Board. She also serves on the board of the Long Island Arts Council. Mireille received her BA from Brooklyn College, where she was an art, English literature, and classics major. She earned her master's degree in reading and a professional diploma in special education at Adelphi University. She attended both the Sorbonne undergraduate and graduate programs at the École de Louvre. Mireille will be sharing her testimony and the testimony of her late husband, David. If you have any questions or comments throughout the program, please feel free to write them in the chat. Thorin and I will be reviewing the questions and comments, and we'll pose them at the end of the program during the Q&A portion of our talk. And with that, Mireille, I give the floor to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm going to tell, it's like a double header kind of story. My personal narrative is called The Last Train from Paris, because my father told me that we took the last train from Paris as it was deciding how and when to surrender to the invading Nazis. My husband's story is called The Kindness of Strangers, based on a saying by Seneca about how the world is saved by strangers who are kind to one another. He and his entire family were lucky enough to survive the Holocaust because so many people reached out to help them. So let me begin by introducing my family in the first slide, the family album. And that's my mom and dad. That was taken about 1931. And background story, mom was a big city girl from Warsaw. She and her family left Poland shortly after the First World War. She was 13 years old. And because of the economic climate in Poland, my maternal grandmother decided there was no future and decided to immigrate to France, where she already had family. So mom was about 13 when she moved to France, finished her education in France, and met my father in Paris. My father came from a small city near the Russian border. His dad died when he was about 3, and his mother brought him up in the circle of a very large, extended, loving family. During the First World War, my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, took the entire family over the border to Russia, which subsequently saved our lives in the Second World War, and I'll come to that. And my father spent his early childhood in Russia. When the First World War ended, he and his mother and the rest of the family returned to Poland, but at this point he was somewhere around 13, and his mother passed away. So he was totally orphaned and went to live with his older sister in Warsaw, where he realized there was no future for a boy like him in Warsaw. So he did odd jobs, he stayed with the family, and he saved enough money to leave France, to leave Poland to go to France, which was the country of immigration for many people who could not afford to get to the United States. When he got to France, he overextended his visitor's visa on purpose, became an itinerant farm worker following the crops in Brittany, and realized he really didn't like farming life at all, and went back to Paris, where he renewed his knowledge of the leather business. It had been a family business, and became apprentice and learned to make handbags. Met my mother, and they were married in 1931 or approximately, but I think this is their engagement picture. My sister Raymonde was born in 1934, and this picture was taken about 1935 or 6. I think the date is wrong there. And I was born in 1938. My parents had a passion for opera. So everything that my parents became involved with were named after operas. Raymonde from Raymonde. I am Mireille, but all my life until I was about 13, I was always called Mimi, La Bohème. Mireille is a bad opera by Gounod. My father's company was called Manon. And so we had a very happy life in France. However, these are the 30s. And my maternal grandmother realized that conditions in Germany certainly boded no good for the Jewish population anywhere. And she urged my father to see about leaving France should things become worse, which of course we all know they did. And her comment, as I was told, was, I have family. My grandmother had extended family in the United States, and you have family in the United States, and hopefully someone will be able to help us prepare our families. My mother became a naturalized French citizen, which was quite difficult. It wasn't like America, where after 5 years residency, one could become a citizen. But mom became a naturalized citizen. Ray and I were declared to be French nationals at the local mairie, the village hall. And these were my parents' ID papers. And I show them because I need to point out something quite interesting. Dad's ID papers were taken profile because of the stereotype of Jews having large noses. Mom's ID paper was taken full face. Of course, she was very beautiful, but French national ID will always full face. And so therein lies a huge difference in perception of other people and of Jews. In 1939, my entire family, the extended family, grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, were on vacation in Fontainebleau when Poland was invaded by the Nazis. Everybody returned to Paris and tried to deal with the situation as best as one could under the circumstances. Dad signed up to be in the French army because he felt a debt of loyalty. And he was not refused, but told they didn't need him right then because he was an older man with children. Some of my family members were able to join the French army or the French Foreign Legion if they were not French nationals. And so in the first part of the war, which was called the phony war, there were air raids, but Paris was supposed to be an open city. And so there was very little bombing of Paris. The air raids would sound, and we were told to go to the metro, the subway, or in the basements of the apartment buildings. Ration cards were issued because food was being sent to the French troops. And so life was very, very difficult. But that being said, my parents kept waiting to see, of course, whether their papers would be processed, what would happen. And France had been invaded in September. France joined the war, went to Poland's defense in September 39, and in the first few months were the phony war. But by the spring of 1940, the war became hot, and my dad was called up probably the last week of May or the first week of June. And if we could go to the next slide. Let's go back a slide, excuse me. Sorry. Then my father was called up, and by this point, his papers had come through. And he explained to the commanding officers that he was a family man, that he was Jewish, and the commanding officer said dismissed. And so he went back to fetch my mother. And we took what we took what was going to be the last train out of Paris. Now, if we could go up a slide, please. And we traveled across France, hoping to get to Bordeaux. And from Bordeaux, we were hoping to get to Spain. And our train was bombed not too far from Bordeaux. We were lucky to be alive, and we were able to walk to the nearest city. And I still have my shoes. I don't know if I can show them. There we go. I still have the shoes that I wore when we were bombed off the train. We couldn't enter Bordeaux. It was a closed city. The French government had escaped to Bordeaux. The American government had set up temporary headquarters in Bordeaux, and we were blocked in this small city about 30 miles perhaps from Bordeaux. And as you can imagine, the streets were filled with refugees going every which way. By one of those remarkable coincidences, my father met the American consulate officer who had prepared our immigration papers, and she remembered my father very distinctly because of the following information. My mother, my sister, and I were traveling with French passports. My father had been declared stateless because he had never served in the Polish army. Poland did not recognize his Polish nationality. One of my father's cousins, Charlie Chisholm, who had immigrated as a very young man and was living in Chicago, was able to get my father an extremely unusual identity. My dad obtained what was called a Nansen passport. And the Nansen passport was issued by the League of Nations. There were only 2,000 of them issued. And they were for the Russian, white Russians who were fleeing the Red Russian Army. Because Dad had lived in Russia in that moment of time in the First World War, he had some kind of strange quasi-Polish Russian identity. And this is what saved his life in terms of national identity. So this is one of the papers that Dad carried with him, stamped by all kinds of like American consulate, the Portuguese consulate, the Spanish consulate. Anyway, Dad meets the American consulate officer who was trying to get across from the western coast of France to the eastern coast to the western coast. And she hired a truck, and Dad and we climbed into the truck and traveled through the Pyrenees. We went to the Mediterranean border where she traveled to Marseille, more of our documents. My mother saved everything, and I'm so grateful to her for doing that, so I can share this with you. And then if we can go to the next document. Oh, okay, we'll stay here for a moment. We traveled from to Perpignan. The American consulate officer went on to Marseille, where the United States was establishing their consulate office. We needed to get across the border, but meanwhile, my sister had outgrown her shoes. So we had stopped in Perpignan to buy her new shoes, and I wandered off. And of course, they were quite upset. And they finally found me several hours later at the bottom of the shoebox, shoe carton, playing with shoes. We traveled into Spain. We were not allowed to get off the train in Spain. Franco was very happy to accept transit money, but he didn't want refugees in Spain. He had enough issues with his own government and reestablishing a country after the Civil War. We then traveled into Portugal, and we were part of the Greek convoy that was crossing the North Atlantic in a convoy because they were German submarines. We left Paris in June 1940 and arrived in the United States in August 11th, 1940. Now, the reason that hat is shown is that how do you date old pictures? You look at other clues. So in this picture, my American auntie, who was living in Denver, had been there since probably the First World War, came to visit my dad. So that's Aunt Denise and my father and mother in the background, and my sister Ray. And I'm still wearing the same hat that I wore in my carriage in 1939 that you saw in the other picture. And that's my sister and I in Williamsburg, where we first lived. We lived there for 2 years, and then I moved to another area of Brooklyn, where I grew up a very happy child. I knew there was a war. I would hear my parents talk about it. When France was liberated, my father and family members were able to send care packages to our family in France. I was very much aware of what was going on, but I was a very lucky child that I grew up in the United States and had the education and the future that I was going to have. So that's my story. The next story is a little different. It's my husband's story. So we'll go to The Kindness of Strangers. And that Jewish star that you see there is actually my uncle's Star of David. And in the countries of occupation where Jews had to wear a labeling identification, the Star of David, it was always labeled in the language of the country that was being occupied. So juif is the French word for Jew. And this is his story. So let me introduce you to my husband and his family. These are David's parents. My mother-in-law's name was Hancha Annette, and my father-in-law's name was Mordechai. And they also were from Poland originally. Mordechai came from Warsaw. He was a skilled leather worker. My mother-in-law and my father were related, large family kind of thing. And she came from obviously from the same small city that my dad did. And when they were married and living in Warsaw, my father-in-law realized, again, no future for Jews who were trying to earn a living to start a business, etc. So my father, at this point, already living in Paris, wrote to Mordechai and said, "You're a skilled leather worker. France is the center for fashion. You must come to Paris and try to see if you can earn a living." And so he did. He arrived in 1929 and he apprenticed to make leather handbags. His wife, Hancha Annette, came in 1930 with David's older brother, Jacques. Jacques was 10 years older than David, and David was born in 1932. So that's David's parents. If we go to the next slide, and this is David's family. David and Jacques in 1935. And in the middle photo, we have in the back row David's father, Jacques, his uncle Morris, who was visiting from the United States, David's mother, Annette, David, about 1938, 39, 38. He had the mumps in this picture. And cousin Suzanne, who was visiting from Warsaw, perhaps hoping to marry a Frenchman. Unfortunately, she did not. She went back to Poland and she did not survive the war. David circa 1939, and I included the other picture of David with his father, taken somewhere around 1935. And the reason I included it is that they're on vacation, but if you look at my father-in-law, who always dressed like that, he wears a white shirt, a jacket, polished shoes, he's carrying a beret, and actually he looks like a French undercover cop, which is what saves his life when he's caught in a roundup. So that was the point of showing his at this point, this picture. We can go to the next slide. And the war began in 1939. David and his family on vacation, as I said, extended family, went back to Paris. Jacques volunteers for the French army and is not allowed to serve because he is not a French citizen. He does serve with the French Foreign Legion. David's father wants to serve in the French army, but he is an older man and he had some health issues, so he's promptly rejected. And again, we have Paris during the war, and David and his parents lived in the part of Paris that actually did get bombed because they were located between two railroad stations, the Gare du l'Est, the station of the East, and the Gare du Nord, the station of the North. The first few months, the phony war, and then the major push of Germany invading France, as you can see from the map, quickly overwhelming within several months. And David's mother was concerned that, of course, for survival because conditions were so difficult. And so she had a not even a store, but a push cart. And she sold men's clothing, women's clothing, children's clothing to mostly the workers who worked for the French railroad station, French railroads. And she made many friends. She was very outgoing. She spoke French without any kind of accent. And one of her very good friends and customers suggested that David be sent away from Paris for safety and to her family in La Guépie, France. And La Guépie is a town in southwestern France. It's in the middle of nowhere. And these pictures, which I took several years ago, it still looks like that today. It's a beautiful little village. It's not a town. There are about 3,000 people, and it's quite charming. So he's sent there for several months, and the war ends. Jacques is decommissioned from the French army and asks to be sent to La Guépie, where he'd like to be with his brother. France is divided in half. The northern half is the occupied zone where David's parents are. David is with the Mercadier from May to October of 1940. And Jacques, who is decommissioned from the army, stays with David and then realizes that after a while they have not heard from their parents and they have no idea how they are managing in occupied Paris. So they decided to go back from La Guépie back to Paris. And of course, they're crossing all the railroad lines and they are stopped at various points with checkpoints. And a German soldier at the beginning of the occupation examines David's papers and says to Jacques, "Who is this person named David?" David was not a typically French name. And David didn't look like most French children, like many French children. He was a very large sized child. He had red hair, green eyes, freckles. And when the soldier looks at David with a name like David, he realizes he's probably Jewish. But this is the beginning of the occupation. And the Nazi soldiers were told to be correct with with the people in occupied France. So he waves them through, they get back to Paris. And within several days, Jacques is arrested and sent to a French prison camp, not very far from Orléans. And I'll tell you about that afterwards. David goes to school, and this picture is taken in the schoolyard in about 1940. These are a group of scouts. There are different kinds of scouting groups in France. There are the Catholic Scouts, there are the Jewish Scouts. This is a non-denominational group of scouts. And David is there in front, staring into the camera, and they're taught all kinds of survival techniques by a sympathetic teacher. David told me that many of the students in this photograph did not return after the war. They probably did not survive, but it was a mixed group of students. Life into the occupation becomes very challenging, even more challenging than it had been during the war. And I'm going to tell you a few things that were an issue. All the Aryan Nuremberg laws that had been placed into other countries were also placed into France. So they had to register with their religion at the police office. They had to wear a Star of David. You saw the one that was in the photograph. The Star of David was made out of rayon, and they were only issued 3 as part of their clothing allowance. And they were very fragile. They would fall apart. You can see the cloth shredding at the top of that photograph. So that, and if you were caught without the Star of David, you were, of course, summarily shot or certainly imprisoned. There were no recreational facilities available for Jews. You could not ride the subway or the trams. Where there was rationing along food lines. Jews were not allowed to attend movies. At the very beginning of the occupation, David and his father back in Paris go attend a movie in their neighborhood, and they're in the balcony because the main section was reserved for Nazi soldiers. And my father-in-law looks down and he says, "Oh, we're never coming back again," because it was full of Nazi soldiers. So no movies, no recreation. Media, of course, is controlled by the Nazis. Jews are not allowed to practice their professions. Jews can only be treated by Jewish doctors. Jews are not allowed to own any kind of property. My mother-in-law's pushcart was taken over by an Aryan manager. And I was told that when he came in to claim the store, she told him that she would not keep the store open, and that she hoped that he would that his family would be very proud of him. She was extremely outspoken. She could have been denounced because she said quite a few other things as well. He did not say anything. They closed the store. After the war, my mother-in-law found out that he had taken over a number of very significant businesses. This was the least important business that he was overlooking. And he returned any profits and any monies made to any survivors that did come back after the war. So an interesting kind of juxtaposition. There were curfews. Jewish teachers were not allowed to teach in the public schools. Life was horrendous and got worse and worse and worse. Conditions were such that there were rumors about the French prisoners in the French concentration camp, that they were starving and that the food allocation was less than it was at Dachau. And my mother-in-law received a letter from her son, Jacques, who was in this French concentration camp at Beaune-Marie. And in the letter is a chocolate bar. And she was amazed because if they're starving, why is he sending her a chocolate bar? She opens up the chocolate bar and she realizes there is a note inside that describes the conditions of life in the camp. And she decides that she's going to make an escape. And so with the help of her friends who were the railroad workers, they were among the first resistance fighters in France, by the way. She takes a train from Paris to Orléans, and from Orléans she takes a donkey cart to Beaune-Marie. When she leaves Paris, she takes David with her, and they both walk out with she's carrying a handbag and it's covering her chest. So David doesn't show. David is holding a book against his chest. And they get on the train to Orléans. From Orléans, they take a donkey cart to Beaune-Marie, which is a small village. And there are a couple of stores in the main section of town. And beyond that, there are fields and there's a barn. And she knocks at the door at one of the stores and she says to the woman who owns the store, "I'd like to sleep in your barn." And the woman says, "Why?" And my mother-in-law says, "I'm here to make my son escape. He's in the camp." And the woman responds, her name was Madame Desmarais. She responds, "No, you can't sleep in the barn, but come into the house and we'll talk about this." So my mother-in-law comes into the kitchen and they start to talk. And my mother-in-law tells her the story, of course, obviously saying, "We are Jewish." And Madame Desmarais calls for somebody to come out of the back room. And David tells me that the tallest gendarme, police officer he has ever seen in his life, comes out from the back room. And of course, to a little boy, any police officer looks quite large. And Madame Desmarais turns to the police officer and she says, "If you want to marry my daughter, you will help Madame Taub and help her son escape from the prison camp." And he does. They concoct a plan. Jacques was a trained electrician, and so he's allowed to go into the main town, into Beaune, and work with the electrician. And in reality, he's being fed so that he can regain the strength he lost under starvation conditions. And this goes on for about 2-3 weeks, and he regains his strength, and he's to surrender his exit pass several days before the planned escape. On the day of the planned escape, he walks out supposedly holding an exit pass in his hand. And of course, the gendarme at the gate is the gendarme who was to marry Madame Desmarais' daughter. He lets Jacques through. David has a bicycle for Jacques and hiding in the woods, and Jacques gets on the bicycle and pedals away. David goes back to where he's been staying with his mother after doing some things he really shouldn't have been doing, like dropping notes in collaborators' mailboxes about how they will be hung after the war. And he keeps a few of the notes on him, actually. He's a little boy. And he takes it, they take a train back to Paris. They're probably on the same train that Jacques is, but they don't meet. And they returned to Paris, and towards the middle of, at the end of the night, or very early in the morning, there is a knock on the door, and it is the French police who are knocking at the door. And my mother-in-law says, "What do you want?" And they said, "We've come to tell you, we've come to look for Jacques Taub." And my mother-in-law says, "He's in the prison camp." And they say, "No, he's escaped." She says, "Oh, thank you for telling me the good news." And they come into the apartment. They probably burst into the apartment, and they start, this is a tiny, tiny apartment. And they start looking through the apartment for Jacques, under the bed, in the closet, in the drawer. And they find some of David's papers about collaborators being hung. And they start slapping him, and they start slapping my mother-in-law for being part of the resistance. She runs to the window overlooking the courtyard, and she says, yells, "Stop beating up my son." And they were a little intimidated by her outspokenness. And they said, "Okay, Jacques is not here. Let's see if he's hiding at where you have your storage area." So they walk through the streets, and people stop them and say, "Madame Taub, are you opening up the store again?" And she says, "Not until Say Monsieur," these gentlemen, which is the euphemism for the German occupation, "not until Say Monsieur leave." They go to the storage area. Actually, Jacques is not there. What a surprise. And Jacques is hiding in various apartments for the next several days in Paris until he can get his false ID papers, which again, the railroad workers are preparing for him. When the papers are delivered, he's out on the street trying to figure out how to get out of Paris when he is caught in the roundup. And the commanding officer of the group looks at Jacques' papers and realizes there's a mistake, and it wasn't a printing mistake. The printer was not very good in geography. He made a critical mistake of saying where Jacques was born. And the commanding officer says, "You were born where?" And Jacques realizes there is a mistake on his papers, and he hems in his horse, and the commanding officer, realizing that Jacques is probably an escaping Jew, says, "Get out of here." And so Jacques runs away, manages to get out of Paris, and escapes into Toulon in Vichy, France, and is there for a period of time, and then goes to his employer, he is working there, and says to his employer that he needs a day off to find a new place. He's been bombed out. And the employer looks at him and says, "You are very lucky you have a job." And Jacques realizes that he could be denounced again, and then said, "Oh, you're so right. I'm so sorry. I asked you, I'll be back later at my appointed time," and actually leaves Toulon and joins the resistance. So from that point on, Jacques fights with the resistance with Naki in Vichy, France. And that's how he spends the rest of the war. If we can go to the next slide, again, back to the conditions in Paris, they're told to surrender all their major belongings. David's mother is told to surrender her the bicycle, the kiddie bicycle that David had, and they did not. They simply overlooked it. At the end of the war, they receive a citation for not having surrendered the bicycle. They're also told to surrender the radio, which she has put into pieces of radio into a box and brings it to the mairie. And the police officer says to her, "This is not a working radio." She says, "If you release my son from the prison camp, he's a radio electrician. He will fix it, and then you can have your radio." As I said, she was very outspoken. So these are typical of the kinds of things that were going on under the occupation. If we could go to the next slide. Oh, let's go back a minute because I'm not ready to go there. The conditions in Paris become increasingly difficult, as I said before. And in the early summer of 1942, there are increasing rumors that there will be a roundup of all the Jews. And in July 17th, 1942, there was indeed a roundup of almost all the Jews in Paris. my in-laws and David had heard about this and had decided to hide in an abandoned apartment owned by cousins of theirs. And so they're in the apartment for 2 weeks while this is going on in the streets. Jews of Paris ascend to Ville d'Hiver under unspeakable conditions. And from there, they're shipped to Drancy, and from there, from Drancy, they're shipped to Auschwitz and other camps in Poland, death camps. David and his parents are in the apartment for 2 weeks, and they hear all of this that's going on. And during this time period, again, their friends, their neighbors, the people who work for the railroads, prepare exit strategies for them. And Madame Pfeffer, one of their friends, has made arrangements for passers to take them across from occupied France to unoccupied France. Most of these passers were petty gangsters and hoodlums. And so they come out after 2 weeks with the passers, and they board a train that will take them across France. And there are all kinds of situations that occur on the train where the passers are telling other passengers on the train, we are taking Jews across France. And when my father-in-law hears this, he says, if you don't stop talking, I will never pay you your money. And the story went is that they were supposed to take them to a point in France where they would enter a farmhouse. The front of the farmhouse was going to be in occupied France. The rear of the farmhouse was unoccupied France, and they would come out the rear and be in unoccupied France. Well, that wasn't quite true. They come across to a small city in France, and the passers refused to take them across the passing line, which is actually like a railroad trestle. And my mother-in-law looks at them and she says, the one thing that one should be very careful saying to a young hoodlum, she tells the youngest of them, you're not man enough to take me across. And the young hoodlum says, I am too a man, and proceeds to take them across. Sentries are watching them and see that they're crossing, and they are shot at. And if we can go to the next slide, they run through the woods, and they escape into the free zone through the woods, through the railroad crossing, and they come out on the other side into a clearing, a small little village. And there's a cafe where they stop to catch their breath. And the woman from the cafe comes out and says to them, may I help you? And my mother-in-law, very outspoken, literally takes her literally and says, we're escaping Jews. Yes, you can help us. And this woman, very sympathetic, says, okay, and calls for her son, who also happens to be a gendarme. And she tells her son that he will take Monsieur and Madame Taub and David across from the bus, on the bus to the furthest point that the bus will go. He is to stay with them. And when they are checked at various checkpoints for their papers, he is to say their family. And so they go to the furthest point they can on this bus, and he leaves them in the bus station. And my mother-in-law grabs David's father by one arm, David by the other arm, run through the station, yelling at the top of her lungs, we'll be late for the wedding, you'll be late for the wedding. And they run out, and everybody's astonished, nobody stops them. And they are in this small city where they stay for several weeks. And my father-in-law begins to run out of money. And he tells the hotel owner where they're staying, can we talk about the price of the hotel room? If I pay you by the week, will it cost less? And the hotel owner says, I'll get back to you. And in the middle of the night, there is a knock on the door, and David's parents are arrested because they have crossed the line of demarcation illegally. David is not arrested because he is a French national. Like my sister and myself, he had been declared a French national at birth. So they're brought to the Palace of Justice in Pau, and David's father says to the judge, I'd like to make a phone call. And David's father never really spoke French without an accent. He was definitely a foreign-looking Jew. His saving grace is that he was a very proper-looking person. So the justice says to him, who do you know here? And he happened to name the most important man in the area, whose son had been a friend of Jacques in Paris prior to the war. The judge, somewhat intimidated by my father-in-law's acquaintances, says, put him on a train. And they were put on a train and sent to a town called Lacombe, which was a ghetto town. They had to register every day that they were still in residence, and once a week a bus would come and take people, and they would never come back. So they were there for a brief period of time, and David's father was put on the bus and taken to Cass, the military encampment nearby. And he was the first one off the bus. Remember I said he looked like a French police officer with his white shirt and his suit jacket and his beret and his shiny shoes. He gets off the bus and he is saluted by the police in the camp. And they say to him, "Ça va, chef?" Meaning, is everything okay, chief? And he says the only thing he can say in French without an accent. He says, "Ça va," salutes them back, walks out of the camp into the town, up the street, into the hills, and he hides in the hills for the duration of the war. David's mother is not arrested, but she's obviously very concerned that she could be next. And they're not terribly far from where David had been in the beginning of the war. So she contacts the family and she asks them to take David back and have them keep him. And so he goes back to La Comida, and this time he starts his identity as a little French boy in this town. The priest comes to visit him, and David, like his mother, somewhat outspoken, says to the priest, "I am not converting." And the priest says, "I'm not expecting you to convert, but I am expecting to see you at Mass. And you will be helping me as an altar boy, and you will be joining the Catholic Boy Scouts, and you will be a good little boy and be an honor to your parents." And so David became a little French boy living on a farm under very harsh conditions. They took care of him, but they were as difficult with him as they had been with their own children. He was not the spoiled little darling of his mother. And so life was very different. He went to school there. He was told to keep a low profile, so to speak. He had done very well in the national assessments, and in France, the results of the assessments, the state tests, are put on the schoolhouse door, the village door, the church door. David always ranked first in the county, the department, and his name was never listed as first because David Taub was a Jewish name. So he was listed somewhere in the middle, and everybody called him Dede. He was told not to go swimming in the river because he was circumcised and it would be very obvious. And so he had the secret identity. And it was a very tough life for this little boy who had been, I would say, probably a somewhat spoiled child until the events of the war. He's there for 2 years. And if we can go to the next slide. Okay, La Getty, and then the next slide. This is Grandma. She loved him. He went around and he helped her feed the pigs and the geese to prepare the foie gras. He worked setting up bowling. She didn't speak French. She spoke only Provençal, and David learned to speak to her in Provençal. And he was there from 1942 to 1944. She wrote him in her will because she loved him so. He was the little grandson that she would love to have because she only had granddaughters from the people who were staying. And if we'll go to the next slide. Maybe go to the next slide. This is the house in which David was living, and that's David on the bottom and the little attic room where he lived for 2 years. His host family said to him, "We never have to wash the dishes after David eats. He licks the plate clean." His rationing food was not rationed because it was a farm area, but the people were careful with food. And when David was questioned after the war, what was the good thing about the war, anything that positive, he said, "I never had a cavity because they took away all my sugar rations." So that was David, meant several years ago. We'll go to the next slide. And David in 1944, proudly wearing the suit he had bought himself with the money he had been sent and what he earned. David after the liberation. He actually looks a little better there. His parents and his father, his brother after about 1945. He's still wearing the same suit jacket, different pants, I think. And then we'll go to the next slide. I took these two pictures because I thought they would be interesting in terms of perspective. Beaune-Hollande was the camp in which David's brother was imprisoned. When the Jews of Paris were rounded up, the children, some of the children were sent to Beaune-Hollande. And I was able to trace my mother's niece, my cousin Madeleine, who was rounded up in 1942, to Beaune-Hollande, where she was later deported to Auschwitz. She did not survive. The second photograph is the marker that the people in this town had put up for where the escape passage was. When we visited the town, we asked several people of a certain age, can you show us where the trestle, where the railroad passage was? And most people said, oh, I don't know anything about this. And finally, we found an elderly gentleman who says, I'll take you right there. And so there had been a kind of monument and we took a photograph. So that's the escape paths where people were able to escape into unoccupied France. We can go to the next slide. David and I went back to France to study and re-met David because I had actually known him from my infancy. And we were married in France, we remarried in New York, and then the other picture was taken a number of years after that, first and second marriage. And then we can go to the next slide. My family. The top photo, I have 3 children. So the top photo is Bill, my youngest son, David and I, my daughter Elizabeth, and my son Peter. The second slide on my left is Sydney, my granddaughter, David and I in the middle, Sam, my oldest grandson, and Dylan, my youngest grandson, Dylan Mullen, Bob and Bob. The third slide is taken about 4 years ago at Sydney's high school graduation. So Peter at the end, Janice, my daughter-in-law, Dylan hiding behind Janice, Sam in the middle, Rick behind, my son-in-law behind Sam, Elizabeth, Bill, Sydney, the star of the moment, and me. And we are very happy to have been able to live through this and tell you about it. So that's the story.
Thank you so much for sharing. And as you said, it was 2 testimonies. So I just appreciate that you're able to continue David's testimony. And I wanted to say that it's as if it's your own, the way you share it. It was pretty remarkable. Wanted to ask you about that, what it was like to, did you do the testimonies together at one point, and then what was it like to continue doing your testimony with David's?
David did his testimony until almost the end of his life. He died 10 years ago. At the last few months, because at this point he was quite ill, I was there to support him, to remind him to stay on track, because David was very talkative and sometimes would wander off track. But after he passed away, I felt it was important that I share his testimony, perhaps more than mine, but it is a joint story. It's 2 families that had a happy ending.
You tell it with such detail and care. It's remarkable.
You know, I see there's some questions that have come in from the audience, Mireille, and I'm going to pose them to you, just about your own family's departure to the United States and immigration to the United States. Well, how were you able to get into the United States? Was there assistance provided by anybody in particular, and what was the challenge like of that?
Okay, my dad's cousin, Charlie Chisver, and I noticed that his nephew is online. I'm still in touch with the family. I don't know how Charlie was able to get Dad the Nancy passport, and I suppose that he arranged for my mother's and my sister and our papers as well, and it was done through HIAS. So when we arrived in New York, I was detained at Ellis Island. I had broken out in a rash, And my mother convinced the doctor that I had hives and stress, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't until several years ago that I had realized I must have had the chicken pox because I came down with shingles. However, that being said, we arrived in New York finally from Ellis Island, and my dad had sent cables to our American family. We're here, we're coming, and they were never delivered because there was an embargo on shipping news in 1940. And so Dad said his first word, taxi, in English, and it's the same word in French. And the taxi took us on the scenic route of New York and left my dad with $10 and took us to Hyas, where we stayed for several days till the American family came along and collected us. So that was how we came to the United States and to New York. We were supposed to go to Chicago. Charlie had found my father a job with Marshall Fields, but New York is the center of fashion, and my dad was a leather worker, so we stayed in New York and practiced his profession.
Yes, so that was another question somebody asked, was just about what did your father do when he came to the United States? And
Well, he worked for a company that actually, I remember this, that made handbags for the wax, because I wanted to be a wax when I was a very little girl. And then right after the war, they must have decided they were not going to go back to France, although there were other family friends that did return to France after the war. Dad had started a business, Man in Handbags, and it was this very successful luxury handbag business. And up in the top closet, the top shelf of my closet, I have the Museum of Man in Handbags. And his bags are featured in books about, luxury handbags from the 50s and 60s and 40s. So I'm very proud of that. The handbag queen.
I've noticed you wear some stylish handbags, Mireille, and now I know where it comes from.
Right.
There were a few questions that came up about the difference between occupied France and Vichy France. And you talk about the escape and getting down to Vichy France, but could you talk a little more? Was it completely safe in Vichy France?
No, of course not. The president of Vichy France, this new country that was established, was General Pétain, who was very revered by the Frenchmen because he had been a hero of World War I. The only problem with the General Pétain was that he was almost as big a fascist as Hitler. And so he adopted a lot of the extreme policies, but not to the extent that occupied France was. But he had his own milice and his own police arresting Jews. Life was very problematic in Vichy France. Conditions were very bad. There were roundups, but it wasn't to the extent that it was in occupied France. But France has often been criticized as being a nation of collaborators. And in every country, there are good guys and bad guys. But from what I have read and have heard from family members, there were so many that reached out and helped the Jews. The cousin's apartment in which David was staying, those cousins were being hidden on a farm in France during the war, and they hid several Jewish families. Several years ago, our cousins, children who had survived, nominated them for Yad Vashem because they were people who reached out and helped Jews.
Yeah, I think I just to follow up on what you were saying, I mean, I think many Parisians in 1940 thought that Vichy France was going to be significantly safer. And so people tried to get down there. But when they got to Vichy France, they often found that at least the government there was still interested in arresting Jews and putting them in camps.
Absolutely. My mother's family and my father's sister escaped out of Paris. I'm not quite sure how they did, but they got to Vichy France, and then they went down to Marseille, and conditions in Marseille were horrible. People were starving. Grandma's family were able to take them get them paperwork that would allow them to escape from Marseille to Casablanca, and they came to America in 1942, the middle of the war. So it was Grandma and her husband, my Uncle Leon, who starved David I had, and my Aunt Jeanette, Uncle Henry, and Marcel all got out of unoccupied France, Vichy France, in 1942.
And we have a question about your how did your father-in-law survive after his escape? It sounds like he was there for 2 years. Is that correct?
He was
And then-
hidden in a very obscure, rural, inaccessible area in the mountains. When we went to visit that area, because there were still people from the family living there, we wanted to say hello to them, you know, many years later. It was still as obscure and hard to get to as it was during the war. As a matter of fact, there was no road at that time. By the time we traveled, it was a kind of dirt path that we followed. But he was there. Everybody protected him. His hobby was agriculture. So he was growing tomatoes. And they said, be careful about the tomatoes you grow. They're too beautiful. People will want to know who's doing this. So, but he was protected.
Thank you. Let me just see if there. If there's any key messages or takeaways that you'd like to convey about from your experiences or your husband's or both that you could share with us.
I think it's important to share the stories. I think it's important to learn. We learn, unfortunately, how evil people can be, but I think it's also important to learn how good people can be, and that the good outweighs the evil, and we're here as proof of that. So I think that's what's important.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's striking about both of your story and particularly your husband's story is the title of his presentation, right? The kindness of strangers. I mean, you talk about how many people offered assistance. It's almost unbelievable. You talk about how David's mother, just like I'm running away from the Nazis on several occasions. It didn't lead, even when there were gendarmes in the building, it didn't lead to her arrest. Instead, it led to assistance. It's really an amazing story.
Hopefully, when you reach out, hands will be out there to help you. And that's a very important law.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that the kindness of strangers is a message to all of us about our need to be our brother's keepers.
Yes.
And our need to reach out to others and offer that assistance when in need. And we know your own personal story tells us there that if it hadn't been for that, then your family wouldn't exist.
Absolutely.
So an amazing story. I want to thank you very much, Mireille, for sharing these two narratives with us. And Michael, thank you so much for arranging this and getting us ongoing. And I look forward to working with you, Michael, at our next Sunday with Survivor that's going to be coming up in November with Anita Weisbord, and then with our 2G Tuesday later in the month with Fred Gross. But I thank you, Michael, so much for all of this assistance.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Michael.
Thank you, Thorne. Thank you, Mireille. Thank you for everyone for being here, and the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for everything, for allowing this program to breathe and have life.
Everybody, thanks so much. Have a good evening, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Au revoir, tout le monde. Goodbye, everyone.